Hey, how's it going? I'm Sean. Today, we're going to talk about emotion regulation. So, talking about emotion regulation, we're also going to dabble into a little bit of coping skills, but mainly I'll try to stay on topic and talk about regulating ourselves emotionally and what kind of happens. So, as we've discussed in some of our earlier videos, you are constantly communicating. Your mind and your body are constantly communicating, and both of these are constantly communicating with the environment outside of yourself. So, with all this communication that happens, emotion regulation is a huge part of our day to day lives. What we mean by emotion regulation is all of us have a sweet spot where we feel the most efficient. We feel good. You don't feel too full. You're not too hungry, not too cold, not too hot. It's like this perfect existence of I feel one. I feel one with myself. I feel in tune with my environment around me. I got a little hop in my step, whatever you want to kind of call it. So it's this Goldilocks zone. With all this communication happening, we are constantly turning dials within ourselves for louder speakers, lower volume, faster, slower, hot, cold. All these things are trying to happen. It takes a lot of energy out there to get us to this perfect sweet spot of emotion regulation where you're not too logical, you're not too emotional. DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, calls it this wise mind. And what I'm referring to right now, you can kind of look it up yourself. It's the window of tolerance is kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about emotion regulation. So you are constantly trying to regulate your emotion, whether it is conscious or subconscious. What I mean by that is, you ever laugh so hard you cried? Those are two opposite extreme emotions, and that's your body trying to balance itself. Or you get cold, you get the goosebumps, or you see something so cute, you want to squeeze it, you're like, ah, you don't know what to do with yourself. That's your body and your mind and everything trying to balance itself. Almost if you can imagine a pendulum swinging, if you're trying to get to this center, this sweet spot right here, and you're too much that way, you're going to swing this way. But sometimes we overcompensate. So then we swing too high this way. So then our body wants to get us back. And every day, every interaction you have is this pendulum swinging. Sometimes we use what we call coping skills, which we'll get into in just a moment. So as you're trying to regulate yourself and get to that perfect, efficient window, there are some things that take you out of that window. Some basic needs also, sometimes like sleep, eating. Are you thirsty? Are you lonely? Are you tired? Are you hungry? Things like that can take you out of this efficient window and get the pendulum swinging a little bit. So before we even get to coping skills, it's important to have insight and to note if our basic needs aren't met, that pendulum has less resistance and it swings a little bit more drastically. So in other words, if our basic needs aren't met, the mental health things kind of magnify in a sense. So let's talk a little bit or get a perspective about coping skills. So coping skills are not the answer. If we go back to that analogy of a pendulum kind of swinging, and us constantly trying to hit this efficient window, coping skills can be viewed as more air resistance. So it kind of slows it down. So instead of, if our window is kind of smaller, instead of the pendulum swinging like this, it slows it down so we exist in that window for a little bit of a longer time. So another analogy that we can kind of use for this is if you're driving on the road and you hit some speed bumps, it's going to slow you down, right? Or if the surface of something changes, gravel, mud, whatever it may be, the texture slows down the contact with the wheel in the car. So you're going to spend more time in a certain section of the road as opposed to another section of the road which is all smooth. So coping skills are pretty much a change in that surface. So if you can imagine it, here's your sweet spot and the pendulum swinging. Coping skills exist outside of that sweet spot to give a little bit of resistance. So when that pendulum is swinging, trying to get to that sweet spot, it slows down so it exists longer in that sweet spot. So our basic needs are important to be mindful about: eating, sleeping, lonely, tired, hungry, all that good stuff. And also the coping skills. Both of these are 1-2 punch and help us kind of maintain or get into that window of efficiency more and maintain it for a longer period of time. So another way to look at coping skills is if we have our mind and our body communicating with each other and then also communicating with the outside, coping skills can kind of fine tune one of these to provide almost like an anchor. So if my mind is racing and my body's all over the place and I'm no longer connected to the environment outside of myself, coping skills can choose a path to provide an anchor either up top, down low, or with the environment outside there. And once we have an anchor, it can start kind of slowing things down and we can start becoming more attuned and hitting more of that sweet spot. We'll get into a little bit more detail about coping skills, about recirculating the blood, grounding with senses, and all that other good stuff. What I want to do right now, though, is I want to go back into and talk more specifically about that window, that sweet spot. We talked about a little bit of outside of it, and we talked about why we kind of want to hit this window, but let's talk about a little bit more of the window itself. So that window, when we talk about emotional regulation, isn't just impacted by your basic needs. And coping skills on the outside help slow it down, remember? But that window also is wider or less based upon our experiences, based upon our chemistry, and based upon also sometimes traumas that we go through. So sometimes people who have been through a lot of traumas, their window might be a little bit smaller. So when the window's a little bit smaller, you can see how when the pendulum's swinging, it exists in that window a little bit less time-wise. And so some other people who have experienced less trauma or have other kind of regulatory skills or whatever it may be, their window might be a little bit bigger. So the window itself can also change its size depending on our experiences, depending on who's around us, depending on our basic needs, depending on traumas, depending on if we have other diagnoses which happen, depression, bipolar, all of those other factors affect this window on its own as well. Because that window is pretty much, remember, the brain sending messages and connecting, the brain to the body, and the body and the brain to the outside environment. So any one of these tiers of factors can impact the window, how big it is and how small it is, not just the outside of that window coming into it. We'll get into a little bit more detail, not just about the window, but about how trauma impacts us in a later video. One last thing I just want to mention about when we talk about emotion regulation and the window is timing. Sometimes we are quick to judge ourselves as well as others with regards to how quick we are to adjust, to understand, or to process something. I just want to note that everybody has their own window and everybody also has their own clock, their own ability to kind of catch up to something, process it, digest it, absorb it, and have the seeds and the plant start growing. Sometimes we think that something happens in life and we need to be very much on top of it and quick to understand and adjust to it, not realizing that we are outside of our window and we're getting to our efficient window. But a lot of times we sometimes don't have the patience for ourselves to hit this sweet spot in this window, and we want it to happen fairly quickly. We not only do this to ourselves, we sometimes do this with other people around us. The intention is to be mindful that we are human beings and we adjust accordingly with our own timing to something that happens in our lives. So we all have our own windows. We all have our pendulum swinging at different paces, different speeds. It's important to provide patience for ourselves, as well as to remember that other people sometimes that we interact with in our lives day to day, they might be outside their window, and we need to give them a little bit of time and patience as well for that pendulum to swing so that we can communicate more efficiently with one another. That was our quick little video for today about emotional regulation, and we got into a little bit of coping skills. Again, we didn't get into too much detail about it, just a kind of a bird's eye view. As always, appreciate you watching, and if you liked the video, thank you.